In this video, I'll be using salvaged wood to make 2 bedside tables with one hand, my left hand, which is my non-dominant hand. This was a challenge set by Leo at the Handicraft channel. I'll talk more about that towards the end of the video, but for now, let's get on with the build. These kitchen cabinet doors came out of our old kitchen before we renovated it recently. I made a video all about that for my Patreon page, by the way, and link to that in the description box below. These were very heavy, so I took a hand plane to the edge, and it was a nice surprise to find these are solid oak underneath layers of paint. I clamped down one side and figured I could use a mallet to break these apart, but that wasn't really working, possibly because my left arm isn't that strong. So I came up with the idea of just dropping the corners of these onto the floor, and that worked great. I'm going to be making use of the panel parts of these doors, which I half expected to be plywood, but I was pleasantly surprised when I cut into one of them off camera to find out that these are solid oak too. First, I heat up the paint with my heat gun, and when it starts bubbling up like this, I can use my carbide scraper tool to remove the paint. You can find out more about this tool as well as a lot of the other tools that I use in the My Tools link in the description box below. The only problem was that using one hand was slowing me down, but then I remembered that my heat gun came with a scraper attachment, and I decided to give that a try. And that made it a little quicker, but it didn't do as good a job as the carbide scraper at removing the paint, so eventually I went back to using that. When the doors were fully stripped of paint, the oak beneath looked really nice. You can see that it's darkened with age. I wanted to cut away the trim on these panels, and I did that at the table saw using my miter gauge. I wouldn't recommend using a table saw with just one hand, but I found that by using my body weight to push it forward and my left hand to guide the miter gauge, it went okay. Then I could rip the long edges, again pushing with my body and making sure to guide the workpiece towards the fence. With that done, I've got 4 lovely panels to make use of. I cut them to length at the miter saw, and here I found it useful to use a weight to hold the workpiece in place. I'm using the dimensions from a drawing that I did on SketchUp before getting started on this project, and by the way, plans and a cut list for this build are available for free to my patrons on Patreon, or for a small fee via my Etsy store if you fancy having a go at making these yourself. And I know that not everyone has solid oak cabinet doors laying around, so you could easily use plywood to make these or glue up some solid wood panels. To cut the shorter panels, I used a marker pen mark on the miter saw fence to cut the panels to a consistent size. Here at the workbench, I'm screwing down some battens to help hold the workpieces in place while I sand them, and I had to use my head here, literally. I can then sand the panels using my random orbit sander. I'm going to use butt joints here, and I start by drawing a line and then masking off the area where I don't want to get any finish. And that's because it's going to be a lot easier to finish what will be the inside of these panels now than it will be later once it's assembled. I'm using spray varnish here. I can then remove the tape and add some PVA glue, which adheres best to bare wood, and that's why I used the masking tape. I spread out the glue and then got the panels assembled, and then I can get a few clamps on. And I'm positioning the top and bottom panels with a tiny overhang here so that I can flush them up with the side panels later on. I use a damp cloth to clean away any excess glue. And while waiting for the glue to dry, I went looking for some wood that I can use to make the legs, and I pulled out this piece, which as you can see has a big nasty crack in it, but that doesn't matter here because I'm going to be cutting this into strips anyway, and I can just cut away the bit with the crack. It's always nice to find uses for pieces like this. After trimming the edges square, I can run the faces through the thicknesser to clean them up. Next, I'm going to use this protractor to mark up a 10-degree angle at the top of each of the legs. This will give the front leg, the one that leans forward, a 20-degree angle. I could have just cut a 20-degree angle to one of the legs, but I thought I'd prefer the look of it with the angle on both legs. However, I underestimated how difficult that was going to be with only one hand. I cut the angles roughly at the bandsaw, and then I tried to clean up those cuts with a block plane. Normally I'd have used a number 4 plane for this, but that's really more of a two-handed tool, so I persevered, and it was really tricky to get this squared up. This is definitely the part of the project that I struggled with the most, and where I really wished I had use of both hands to plane these pieces square. As you can see, I'm still struggling here to get this join nice and tight. I ended up clamping both pieces together and then using an old sanding block that I had laying around, which I made ages ago. This is either 40 or 60 grit paper, so it removes material quite quickly, and I was able to get it more flat this way. You can see here that it joins together better. There was still a gap at the top, but that's going to get cut away later anyway, so I went ahead with it and applied glue. Here I'm using the offcuts from the bandsaw cuts I made earlier as clamping blocks, so that the clamping pressure is applied evenly without these slipping out of place. A great trick which works really well. Back to working on the tops again, and I can take them out of the clamps. I wanted to cut a 20-degree angle to the front of these too, which I thought would nicely complement the legs, and I decided I'd do that at the bandsaw after marking up where I wanted to make that cut and tilting the bandsaw table. That worked really well. I just needed to sand away the bandsaw blade marks. There were some hairline gaps where the sides were joined to the top and bottom, so I rubbed in some filler. I can then use a flush trim bit in the router to flush up where I'd left a slight overhang. And then I sanded everything. So these butt joints won't be particularly strong at this point because it's an end grain to side grain joint, so I needed to reinforce them, and for that I'm going to add some brass dowel, which will make a nice feature. After marking up where I wanted to drill pilot holes, I used a mirror to help me see what angle I'm holding the drill at, which helps me to drill down nice and plumb. I used a 4mm bit to match the diameter of the brass rod that I had. Then I just scuff up the rod with some coarse sandpaper to help give the glue a bit more to hold on to. And I mix up some epoxy and get some on there, and then I can knock it in place. I used a hacksaw to cut away the excess. And then I can sand the top, and I really wanted to polish up the ends of the brass rod to get them nice and shiny, so I sanded at 120, 240, 400 and then 600 grit. For the bottoms of these, I just used screws because they won't be visible on the underside. I also added a small round over to the edges with my router. Now back to the legs, and I could reference the back of the straight leg against the fence of the miter saw and use that to help cut the ends of the legs at the correct angle. And I wanted to cut a taper to these legs to make them look less bulky, so here I'm marking up where I wanted the tapers to start and end. And I thought about cutting these at the bandsaw, but that would have meant a lot of cleanup work that is really difficult to do with one hand. So instead I used the track saw. You can see here that I'm using the other legs underneath to help support the guide rail at the correct height. And then I used a chisel to clean up the part where the cut finished. I also added a round over to the legs using my router, and that worked well apart from the bit between the two legs, the crotch I guess I should call it. So I fettled all that with a chisel and did some sanding to help it blend in. I wanted these legs to be really dark to contrast with the oak, so I'm going to use some dark oak stain. I brush it on with a paintbrush and then wipe away any excess with a cloth. And here I've set up the table saw to cut the joinery for where the legs will meet the top. And I do that using the mitre gauge to support the workpiece and then take multiple passes, moving the workpiece along before making each pass. I'm left with something that looks like this, and I can just clean it up with a chisel. And there were still some slight grooves left by the table saw blade, so I used the end of the chisel as a scraper to clean those up. I can then get plenty of wood glue on and clamp the legs in place, and I'm using a couple of blocks on the workbench here to give me the offset between the back of the top and where I wanted the legs to be positioned. And I got a couple of clamps on. For finish, I used more of the spray varnish which I used for the inside of the box earlier in the video. I chose this mainly because it would be really easy to apply with one hand, and also it's easier to get to all of the hard to reach areas. I gave everything 3 coats in total, and I denibbed in between each coat with some 400 grit wet and dry paper. Finally, I added my maker's mark to the bottom, and I was a bit too heavy on the heat here, so I knocked it back with some sandpaper. On screen now are some photos of the finished project, and I'm very happy with how these turned out. We don't have a use for these, so these will be available for sale via my Etsy store if you're interested in checking it out. I'll leave a link in the description box below. So as I mentioned at the start of this video, this build was part of the one hand challenge set by Leo Winstanley at the Handicraft channel. Leo damaged a nerve in his neck in a car accident, which resulted in him losing the use of his dominant hand and part of his arm. He was unable to work for some time and decided to take up woodworking and crafting as a hobby, and he started his YouTube channel to document his journey. It's a great channel and really inspirational, I think, and I'll leave a link to his channel below. And I think there's going to be a playlist of the other videos as part of this challenge, which I'll link to below as well as soon as I have it. Working with one hand was far more of a challenge than I expected, and I found it really interesting that the things I had expected to struggle with the most, for example using a table saw, were obviously a bit awkward and difficult, but actually the most difficult things to accomplish were the little things like being able to use a clamp with one hand, unpeeling a roll of masking tape, or getting a heavy piece of wood off a shelf, or getting a drill bit out of the hole I just drilled, or simply holding a ruler and marking up a line. And needless to say, it took me a lot longer to complete this project than it normally would have done had I had the use of both hands. And just to be clear, even though I successfully built the project with one hand, there was plenty here that I still allowed myself to use both hands for. Things like, for example, setting up the camera for each shot, which is another thing which would have been really difficult to do with one hand, and also editing the video too. So quite an enlightening experience really. I'm happy to have experienced it, and now I'm very grateful to have the use of my right hand back again. Let's hope that the same will be true for Leo too, sooner rather than later. Thanks to Leo for setting up this challenge. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can do that via PayPal or Patreon. Links to both in the description box below. On Patreon, you can also get early access to my videos, exclusive content, free project plans and cut lists, including for this project, and a name credit at the end of my videos. Thank you for watching.